Deep in the misty woods of North Carolina, seasoned hunter Dean Hargrove thought he knew every sound the forest could offer. But that morning, as frost clung to the pines and silence wrapped the mountains like a woolen blanket, a faint cry pierced the stillness, high-pitched, fragile, and unfamiliar. Curious, Dean followed it and found a tiny wildcat kitten, shivering and alone. Instinct told him to walk away. Nature was cruel, after all. But just as he turned his back, another cry, desperate and haunting, froze him in his tracks. What he discovered next would unravel the wild's deepest secret, and change him forever. The hunter and the silence of the woods. The Appalachian Mountains were still asleep when Dean Hargrove stepped out of his cabin. Frost clung to the porch railing, the cold biting into his fingers despite the leather gloves. His breath curled like smoke in the early light, and a hushed fog drifted lazily between the towering trees. He tightened his grip on the strap of his rifle, slung over one shoulder, and started down the narrow trail leading into the forest. Dean was 42, tall, broad-shouldered, with weather-worn skin and eyes the color of old pine. His salt and pepper beard had grown thick over the winter, and his boots carried the wear of seasons spent tracking in silence. He wasn't hunting for food that morning. It was something else, habit, perhaps, or the comfort of solitude. The forest was his cathedral. No traffic. No voices. Just the rhythmic crunch of his boots against frozen leaves, and the whisper of wind threading through bare branches. A red-tailed hawk circled high above, silent and precise. Somewhere in the distance, a stream trickled beneath a thin sheet of ice. Dean paused beside an old cedar, brushing his fingers over the bark. His late father had brought him here as a boy, back when deer were plenty and life felt simpler. It had been years since that time. His father was gone now. His daughter too. The memory flickered in his mind like a photograph, her bright smile, tiny boots stomping through fallen leaves, her laugh echoing in the trees. He blinked it away. This morning was like any other. Cold. Quiet. Familiar. Until a sound shattered the stillness. A faint cry. Thin. High-pitched. Dean froze mid-step. Not a bird. Not a fox. He crouched, scanning the forest floor. The cry came again, closer this time, yet still frail. It was a sound he couldn't place, and that unsettled him. He'd spent over 3 decades in these woods. There wasn't much he hadn't heard. Instinct pulled him forward, eyes sweeping the underbrush. Then, he saw it. A small shape huddled under a patch of frost-covered ferns, trembling, its ears flattened. Tan-gray fur, spotted faintly with darker stripes. Its body no larger than a loaf of bread. A baby bobcat. Alone. Dean's breath caught. His rifle slowly lowered. He stared at the kitten, unsure what to do. It didn't hiss. It didn't run. It just looked at him, blue eyes wide and unblinking. For a moment, everything went still. Then, Dean did what any seasoned hunter would do, he turned to walk away. And that's when the second cry came. The cry that changed everything. Dean stopped mid-step, his boots crunching lightly in the frost-laced leaves. The second cry had pierced the silence, louder, longer, more desperate than the first. It wasn't a bird call. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something very small, and very afraid. His instincts twitched. For a moment, he just stood there, listening. The forest had gone deathly still again, as if holding its breath. Then, there it was, another whimper, faint but unmistakable. Dean turned back. Carefully, he stepped toward the undergrowth where he'd first spotted the kitten. It hadn't moved. It was curled tightly into itself, almost trying to disappear. Its little sides heaved in short, frantic breaths. It looked up at him, those huge, frightened eyes catching the soft light like glass marbles. He crouched down slowly. The kitten's fur was matted with frost and debris, but he could see the telltale markings now: black ear tufts, white spots behind the ears, faint rosettes on its haunches. A bobcat, for sure. No more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Much too young to be alone. Dean's heart thumped once, hard. That's when he heard it again, a rustle to the left. He turned his head, scanning the brambles. Something shifted beneath a bed of pine needles. He moved closer and parted the brush. There, just a few feet away, lay a second kitten, this one darker, smaller, and clearly hurt. Its hind leg stuck out at an unnatural angle, and its body was half buried under fallen leaves. It didn't cry this time. It just blinked slowly, eyes glassy with pain. Dean felt something rise in his chest. Not panic. Not fear. Guilt. He was no stranger to pain. He had seen it, caused it, even, in ways he still tried to forget. But there was something about these tiny creatures, fragile and shivering under the vastness of the forest, that struck a chord too deep for words. He took off his jacket and gently wrapped the injured kitten inside. It flinched but didn't resist. Its sibling, stronger, more alert, watched him intently but didn't run. "That your brother?" Dean murmured. "Or your sister?" The uninjured one let out a tiny growl, a sound more pitiful than threatening, and then crept toward the bundle in Dean's arms. Without hesitation, it curled up beside the other. Dean sighed. "Well, that settles that." He stood, clutching both kittens to his chest. Their combined weight was barely noticeable, but the decision felt heavy. These weren't pets. They weren't game. They were wild, but they were also helpless. As he turned back toward the trail, a breeze picked up, rustling the trees above him. The forest, it seemed, had accepted his choice. Still, something gnawed at the edge of his awareness. The placement of the bodies. The scattered leaves. The silence. These kittens hadn't just wandered off. Something, or someone, had left them here. And that meant something else might be watching. From the shadows. The tracks in the snow. Dean trudged back through the forest with the 2 kittens pressed gently to his chest, wrapped in the warmth of his old flannel jacket. Their tiny bodies barely moved now, save for the occasional twitch or shudder. The injured one, whom he'd already started calling Shadow in his mind, barely stirred. The other, with sharper eyes and a flickering tail, clung closely, Echo, maybe. The names felt right. Somehow, the forest had spoken them into existence. He didn't rush. The trail back to the cabin wasn't long, but the terrain was rough in places, and one slip could send both kittens tumbling from his grasp. The mountain air, crisp and still, seemed to listen to his every step. Every so often, he'd glance over his shoulder. He didn't know why. Maybe habit. Maybe instinct. But something inside him felt, watched. A mile from the cabin, he cut across a shallow creek. As his boots splashed through the icy water, Echo let out a tiny chirp and squirmed, her head peeking from the jacket folds. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking behind them. Dean stopped mid-step. The woods had fallen silent again, too silent. He slowly turned. There were no sounds of branches snapping, no rustling leaves, no scampering critters. But then he saw them, prints in the snow. Large, padded tracks that curved toward where he'd found the kittens. They hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. He crouched, careful not to jostle the kittens, and inspected the tracks. Bobcat. Adult. Heavy. Likely a female. The spacing of the prints, the depth, they told a story. She'd circled the area twice, pacing. Watching. She hadn't just abandoned them. She'd been driven away. Dean's throat tightened. He followed the prints for a few yards until they veered off sharply into dense brush. At the edge of a gnarled tree root, he noticed a smear of blood. Faint, but fresh. He looked down at Echo, who was now completely alert, peeking over the edge of the jacket. "Your mama tried to come back, didn't she?" he whispered. "Something scared her off." He scanned the trees. Nothing moved. But deep down, he knew what he felt. Something else had been nearby. And it wasn't human. He picked up the pace, taking a back route to the cabin, avoiding open areas. The kitten stayed quiet the whole time. Even Echo, brave as she was, pressed close to her sibling now. When Dean finally reached the edge of the clearing where his cabin sat, he hesitated. His breath fogged in the air. There, in the soft snow near his front porch, were more prints. The same bobcat tracks, but older, fainter. She'd been here before. "Jesus," he muttered, glancing toward the tree line. "How long have you been watching us?" He entered the cabin quickly, bolting the door behind him. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wave. The wood stove still smoldered from the night before. Dean moved with careful hands, placing the kittens on a fleece-lined basket he'd kept near the hearth, originally used for firewood, now repurposed as a makeshift nest. He warmed goat milk on the stove and fed them with a dropper. Echo drank hungrily. Shadow needed coaxing, his little paws barely moved. Dean rubbed his back gently, whispering nonsense the way he used to when his daughter had nightmares. The quiet moment stretched. And then, a sound. A soft thump, just outside the cabin wall. Dean froze. He didn't reach for the rifle. Not yet. Instead, he stepped to the window and peered through the frosted glass. There, standing in the tree line, barely visible in the gray dusk, was a pair of glowing amber eyes. Watching. Unblinking. Then, just as suddenly, they vanished. Ghosts of the past. Dean didn't sleep that night. He sat in the worn leather armchair near the fireplace, rifle resting against the side table, eyes darting to the window every time the wind shifted. The forest outside was still, but his instincts buzzed like an alarm clock that wouldn't shut off. The bobcat had been there. Watching. Waiting. But for what? He glanced down at the basket. Echo was curled tightly beside Shadow, who still hadn't moved much. The injured kitten's breathing had grown shallow. Dean had wrapped his leg in a thin gauze soaked with warm water and antiseptic. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They didn't belong here. Not really. But neither did he, not anymore. He got up, stoked the fire, and made himself a cup of instant coffee. The bitter taste was more habit than comfort. Then his eyes fell on a small picture frame above the mantel. It showed a little girl, no more than 5, her blonde curls bouncing as she smiled up at a man who looked a lot like Dean, only younger, lighter, unburdened. She was wearing a yellow coat and muddy boots, her tiny hands gripping the tail of a plush toy lynx. Anna. That name had once filled his cabin with laughter. Now, it echoed through the silence like a ghost that refused to leave. She'd loved animals. They'd raised an orphaned squirrel together one fall, and he still remembered the way she cried when it climbed her shoulder for the first time. She used to draw bobcats with big blue eyes and tape them to the fridge. Wilderness guardians, she'd called them. He exhaled slowly, squeezing the coffee mug until his knuckles whitened. How many nights had he spent doing nothing, just waiting for the weight in his chest to lift? And now, these two fragile things had shown up on his path, cracking something open inside him. Maybe it was time. Time to stop just surviving. Dean stood and stepped toward the window again. Nothing but snow and shadow. But he could feel it, that presence. She hadn't gone far. The mother was out there, and he knew she hadn't abandoned her kits. She was wounded or hiding or both, and her cubs would die unless someone did something. "All right," he whispered. The decision came quietly, but completely. If no one else was coming, then he would intervene. He dressed in layers: wool, leather, canvas, and packed what he could: a medical kit, a thermos of broth, and the fleece from the basket. He tucked Echo into a side pouch of his coat, zipping it partially to keep her snug against his chest. Shadow he wrapped in a towel and slid gently into a padded crate meant for feral cats. It had air holes and a heat pack taped inside. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, not for the bobcat, but for whatever else might be in those woods. Before he stepped outside, he lit a lantern and placed it on the porch, a signal. If the mother was still nearby, she'd see the light. Smell her kittens. Maybe even follow. The wind greeted him with a bite, but he didn't flinch. He began to walk back through the forest, retracing his steps to where he'd found them. The prints were mostly gone now, wiped away by a thin layer of fresh snow. But the memory of their shape was burned into his mind. The journey was quiet, save for the crunch of his boots and the occasional whimper from Echo. She wasn't afraid now, just restless, maybe sensing what he couldn't see. Dean stopped at the clearing where the second kitten had been buried in leaves. He knelt and placed the crate beside the bush, then unzipped his coat slightly so Echo could peek out. And then, he waited. The minutes dragged. He listened. Nothing. Just as he started to rise, a low growl emerged from the shadows. He froze. A shape appeared, sleek, low to the ground. She stepped into the moonlight slowly, deliberately. The mother bobcat. Her side bore a fresh gash. Her movements were slow, cautious, but her eyes, those piercing amber eyes, were locked on the crate. Dean raised his hand slowly, palm out. "It's all right," he said softly. "They're safe." She didn't growl again. Instead, she padded forward, nose twitching. Echo let out a soft chirp. That was all it took. The mother bobcat stepped closer, lowering her head to the crate. A deep purr, surprisingly loud, rumbled from her throat. Dean stepped back. In that moment, he understood something. This wasn't just about rescue. It was reunion. And it was only the beginning. A place between wild and home. Dean didn't expect her to follow him. After placing the crate down and stepping away, he had assumed the bobcat mother would take her cubs and vanish into the forest like a ghost returning to mist. But she didn't. She remained at the edge of the clearing, her body low, breath heavy, the wound on her side still fresh. Her gaze flicked between Dean, the crate, and the surrounding woods, nervous, protective, but not hostile. He waited, heart pounding, muscles tight. Then, to his disbelief, she limped closer, not to him, but to the crate. She sniffed it. Echo chirped from inside, and the mother chuffed softly in return. She nudged at the door gently, then sat beside it, watchful, almost as if asking. Dean knelt slowly. "You want them warm tonight, don't you?" It was insane. Every voice in his head screamed against it. But something in the air that night, something ancient and wordless, made him act. He opened the crate door. The bobcat stepped forward, placed her head inside, and licked Shadow's tiny face. The injured kitten twitched, stirred weakly. Echo pressed against her mother's leg, purring so softly Dean could barely hear it. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Then he spoke. "I have fire. Food. Shelter. Let me help." As if she understood, the mother turned her head slightly toward him, then stepped back from the crate and waited. Dean gathered the bundle again. He didn't try to touch her. He just picked up the crate, tucked Echo back into his jacket, and began the walk home, slowly, cautiously. Behind him, soft paws padded over snow. She was following. It was nearly midnight by the time they reached the cabin. A faint halo of lantern light still flickered on the porch, casting long shadows across the snowy clearing. Dean unlatched the door and stepped inside. The warmth hit him like a wave, but he didn't close the door. Instead, he turned back and looked into the darkness. Two amber eyes stared back. "Come in," he said. There was a pause. Then, incredibly, the bobcat stepped over the threshold. She moved with caution, sniffing the wooden floorboards, ears swiveling. But there was no panic in her movements, only fatigue. She limped toward the fire and sat, tail curled around her body like a sentinel. Dean shut the door. For the next hour, he worked quietly. He laid out a thick blanket by the fireplace and placed the crate on top. Shadow whimpered once, but then nestled into the warmth. Echo slipped out of Dean's coat and into the folds of the blanket, nuzzling beside her sibling. Dean set a bowl of water near the mother. He didn't expect her to drink. She did. He cut raw venison into small pieces and left it beside the hearth. She ate. That was when he exhaled for the first time in hours. The room was warm, filled with the soft crackle of fire and the faint sound of kittens purring. Dean leaned against the wall, watching this wild creature, this mother, battered and broken, yet refusing to leave her children. It hit him like a punch to the chest. She reminded him of his wife, Kara. The woman who had once fought through chemo, 3 surgeries, and 2 winters of pain, just to spend one last Christmas with Anna. She hadn't survived the third. He remembered Kara's voice, hoarse and fragile, whispering, "Promise me you'll stay alive, even if I'm not there to remind you why." For a long time, he hadn't. But tonight, something stirred. Not healing, not yet, but the memory of something worth healing for. The bobcat lay beside the crate now, her head resting between her paws. Her eyes flicked to him once, then slowly shut. Dean sat in the armchair again, the firelight dancing across the room. He didn't touch the rifle. He didn't need it. Instead, he reached for the photo of Anna and Kara from the mantel and placed it gently beside the crate. "You'd have loved her," he whispered. Then he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, to the breathing of wild things, to the warmth of a second chance, to the sound of a soul slowly returning to life. Footprints in the dark. The next morning came without fanfare. Gray light filtered through the frosted windows as Dean stirred in his armchair. His neck ached, and his legs were stiff from the awkward sleep, but something deeper inside him felt quieter. He opened his eyes and scanned the room. The fire had burned low, leaving a soft amber glow in the hearth. Echo and Shadow were still curled together in the crate, their tiny chests rising and falling in sync. The mother bobcat remained on the rug, her head now lifted, ears twitching. She had stayed the whole night. Dean rose slowly, trying not to make a sound. The mother watched but didn't move. Her eyes tracked him, not with fear, but with alert trust, the way wild things do when they're deciding whether to flee or stay. He nodded to her. "Morning." She blinked once in reply. He moved to the kitchen and poured water into a kettle. The sound of the flame catching under the stovetop broke the silence, a small hiss filling the room. Then came a noise he hadn't heard in days, a soft mewl. Shadow. The kitten stirred weakly, raising his head for the first time since Dean had found him. Echo instantly chirped and pressed close. Dean walked over, heart thumping. Shadow was awake. Still slow. Still hurting. But awake. "You're a tough little guy," Dean whispered. He dropped to one knee, reached into the crate, and gently scratched behind Echo's ear. She purred so loud it filled the cabin. The mother bobcat let out a low, approving growl. Not a threat. A rumble of presence, as if saying, "I see you. I know." Dean stood and walked to the front door. He needed wood for the fire and air for his thoughts. But the moment he opened the door, he froze. Tracks. All over the clearing. Deep. Sharp. Fresh. Not bobcat. Canine. A lot of them. Dean stepped out, boots crunching the snow. The prints circled the cabin in wide loops. He counted at least 4 different sets. Maybe 5. Larger than coyote. Wolves. He bent down and touched one of the paw prints. Still warm. Less than an hour old. His mind raced. Wolves were rare in this part of the Smokies, especially this close to a cabin. But if the snow was thinning their hunting ground. He turned, scanning the trees. Everything was still. Too still. The mother bobcat's prints were there too, her trail leading back from the forest, directly to his porch. The wolves had crossed it. Followed it. But they hadn't approached the cabin. Just circled. Watching. Waiting. He stepped back inside, bolting the door behind him. She knew. The mother bobcat knew they were close. That's why she stayed. That's why she didn't leave with the kittens. And now, she couldn't. Dean stood at the center of his cabin, staring at the fire, at the kittens, at her. His home wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a line between wilderness and survival. And something had crossed into both. A pact by firelight. Dean didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, one hand on the door, the other resting on the butt of his rifle, though he hadn't touched it since the night the bobcat entered his home. The weight of the wolves' tracks still pressed heavily in his chest. Not from fear. From responsibility. This was his world, his domain, carved out through solitude and survival. But now it had become something else. A refuge. He turned back toward the fireplace. The mother bobcat was lying there, watching him. Her side still bled slightly, a dark stain on her fur. She was breathing heavier than the night before. Slower. She was wounded, sure. But Dean knew that look. She was also starving. He didn't speak. Just moved. From the freezer in the back, he retrieved a wrapped slab of venison. One of the last from his autumn hunt. He placed it on the cutting board, slicing it into long strips. No seasoning. No cooking. Just meat. When he set the bowl beside her, she didn't pounce on it. She looked up at him first. A pause. Then, only then, did she lower her head and eat. It wasn't just hunger that had kept her alive out there. It was caution. Intelligence. And now, trust. Dean sat across the room and watched her. She chewed methodically, never turning her back. When the food was gone, she licked her paw and began grooming the kittens, nudging Echo to clean her ears, curling her body around Shadow like a living shield. Dean had seen something like it before, on the battlefield. A wounded mother in uniform, cradling her child while the world burned around her. His throat tightened. The ache was familiar now. He didn't resist it. Later that afternoon, he brought the med kit from the shed. He approached her slowly, step by step, hands empty, his voice low. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said. She didn't move. Didn't hiss. Just stared. He crouched beside her, letting her smell the kit. Then, gently, he reached forward and began cleaning her wound. She flinched once, but didn't strike. Instead, she watched him with wide, unreadable eyes. And when it was done, he wrapped her side in a long cotton bandage, one paw lifted weakly but without protest. Dean sat back on his heels. "You're not just here for them," he said softly. "You're staying because you know they're safe here." She blinked. Slowly. Once. Maybe it was his imagination. Maybe it was wishful thinking. But in that quiet, flickering room, it felt like they understood one another. Not as man and beast. But as parents. Survivors. Wounded things who still chose to fight for something. Dean stood, heart heavier than before, but warmer, too. This wasn't temporary anymore. Not for the kittens. Not for her. And maybe, just maybe, not for him either. The quiet before letting go. 3 days passed. The storm that had threatened the mountains never came. Instead, the skies stayed clear and cold, the air crisp and blue. Inside the cabin, time slowed to a hush. Dean had settled into a rhythm, warming milk, cleaning wounds, replacing bandages, chopping wood, and feeding not just himself, but a wild family that had become, impossibly, his own. Echo thrived. She now explored the corners of the cabin boldly, climbing onto the armchair and pouncing on shadows cast by firelight. She mewed when Dean left the room and purred when he returned. Shadow remained weak, but the color in his gums improved, and the tremble in his legs had lessened. Every day, he grew a little stronger. And the mother? She watched it all. Sometimes from the hearth. Sometimes from the windowsill. Always silent. Always alert. Dean had stopped trying to rationalize it. She could have taken her kits and vanished back into the forest days ago. Her wound was healing. Her eyes had sharpened again. But she stayed. And so did he. Until the call came. It was nearly evening when the radio crackled to life. A voice, calm, female, professional, came through the static. Ranger Station 9 to Hargrove. You still up at the ridge? Dean hesitated. Then pressed the button. Still here. This is Dr. Elise Monroe. I'm heading up to your area tomorrow morning. Got a report about possible orphaned bobcat kits from one of the lower rangers. That you? Dean looked across the room. Echo was curled up inside his coat on the couch. Shadow slept against the mother's chest, rising and falling with her breath. Yeah, Dean said. That's me. I'm a wildlife rehab specialist with the Appalachian Rescue Network, she continued. I'd like to assess them for rewilding if they're stable enough. You think they're ready? Dean didn't answer at first. He stared at the fire, the cracks in the walls, the dust on the mantel. Then he looked at the photograph of Anna again, still resting beside the crate. They're not mine, he said softly. But, yeah. They're ready. When the line went dead, he didn't move for a long while. That night, he made stew. Real stew. The kind Kara used to make on the first snow: venison, carrot, onion, thyme. The cabin filled with scent and warmth. He ate quietly, the bowl warm in his hands. He fed Echo a spoonful, which she tried to climb into. He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. The mother bobcat watched him from her place near the fire. When he offered her a piece of raw venison, she took it gently from his hand. You did good, Dean said to her. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. When the fire had burned low and the wind whispered against the glass, Dean laid out the crate again, clean, lined with fleece, with a soft wool scarf at the bottom. Tomorrow, they would go. Back to the wild. Back to the place they belonged. But tonight they were home. The last gate. The morning arrived quiet and pale, the sun just beginning to spill over the horizon as the ranger truck rumbled into Dean's clearing. Dr. Elise Monroe stepped out with practiced calm. She was younger than Dean had expected, mid-30s maybe, with thick auburn hair pulled into a tight braid and a pair of kind but sharp eyes. The type of person who didn't just care about animals, she understood them. She didn't waste time. After a polite greeting, she crouched near the crate and took notes silently, watching Echo paw curiously at the zipper flap. Shadow blinked up at her with sleepy eyes, his limp barely noticeable now as he shifted beside his sister. They're strong, she said finally. Clean eyes. Stable weight. The male's leg will heal crooked, but it won't stop him from surviving in the wild. Dean nodded, staring at the two kittens. And the mother? Elise turned slightly. The adult bobcat sat a few yards away, calm, observing everything. She's wild, Elise said. But she trusts you. Dean didn't reply. He just watched the mother, who made no move to run. No growl. No resistance. It was like she already knew what was coming. I'd like to release them together, Elise added. We've got a protected zone near Blackthorn Hollow. Miles of safe forest. No traffic. No traps. If we do it quickly, they won't feel the separation. Dean swallowed. I'll drive. The road to Blackthorn Hollow wound through the heart of the Smoky Mountains. Silent ridges passed like ghosts through the windshield as pine trees blurred past. Elise sat in the passenger seat, the crate between them. Echo chirped every few minutes. Shadow pressed into her like he knew this was the end of something. At the trailhead, they parked and hiked the last stretch. Dean led. The forest here was wilder. The air heavier with pine and possibility. And when they reached the clearing, a quiet glade with mossy rocks, fallen trees, and shafts of gold spilling through the canopy, Dean stopped. This is the place, Elise whispered. Dean nodded. He knelt beside the crate and unlatched the door. Echo was first. Bold, curious, wild. She padded out, tail low, ears swiveling, drinking in the scent of freedom. Shadow followed slowly, his steps cautious but steady. They didn't run. They didn't look back. The mother bobcat stood behind them. She took her time. But when she walked past Dean, so close he could have touched her, she paused. Looked up at him. And for the briefest moment, her amber eyes met his with something unspoken. Gratitude? Recognition? A shared pain? Dean didn't know. He didn't need to. She turned, called softly, and disappeared into the trees with her cubs. And just like that, they were gone. Elise exhaled. I've seen a lot of animals. I've never seen anything like that. Dean stood there, hands in his coat pockets, staring into the forest. I have, he said. Back at the cabin that night, the silence felt different. Not hollow, not aching. Just full. Dean sat by the fire, the picture of Anna and Kara resting in his hands. Outside, the wind stirred the branches. Then, softly, came a cry in the distance. A wild call. Faint and rising. It wasn't grief. It was memory. It was echo. Sometimes, the wild reminds us of what it means to be human. In helping a wounded creature, Dean didn't just save two kittens, he rediscovered a part of himself that had been frozen in grief for years. This story isn't just about a hunter and a bobcat. It's about healing, trust, and the quiet power of choosing compassion when it's easier to walk away. In life, we often pass by things, people, animals, opportunities, thinking, it's not my problem. But maybe, just maybe, the thing we ignore is exactly what's meant to mend us. At Paw Prints and Stories, we believe that every animal carries a story, and sometimes, it's the story that saves us. So here's a small challenge for you today. Is there something, or someone, you've been walking past? Maybe it's time to stop. Listen. Turn around. Because the moment you choose to care might be the moment your own story begins to change. If these kinds of tales speak to your heart, join our journey by subscribing to Paw Prints and Stories. Let's walk this path of empathy together, one paw print, and one story at a time.